Okay, so I'm here to talk to you all today about some pilot work that I've done on the early childhood playground using speech and location wearable sensors. Um, the funding for this work came from the University of Kentucky Early Childhood Research and Development Initiative and the Kansas Intellectual Developmental Disabilities Research Center. The main collaborator on this work was Beth Rouse. Ying Lau, Justin Lang, Joanne Rehos, Haley Burstorm, and Christopher Cushing also assisted in the planning and implementation of this project. So today I'll just be discussing some of our preliminary results from this work. So similar to the early childhood classroom, time spent on the playground in early childhood settings provides opportunities for young children to interact with adults and peers. And these interactions can result in improvements in language, social, emotional, and motor development, as well as physical activity. Some children with special needs may experience limited opportunities for age-appropriate interactions with peers on the playground. And these missed opportunities may slow some of the amelioration of developmental challenges. And we also know that there are contextual factors that influence peer interactions on the playground. So one study found that peer verbalizations were higher in a cozy dome, which is like an igloo-shaped climbing dome compared to a roller slide. So basically what we're seeing here is that we have both child and contextual factors that influence interactions children have on the playground. The way that we assess these interactions are typically with direct observational tools. This is the most common approach. So one tool is Azarac P, which captures physical activity levels, social groupings, and the types of activities that children are in. Another tool is the POPE, which measures peer engagement in outdoor natural environments, so child initiations, parallel play, engagement, and games. Some of the drawbacks to these direct observational approaches are that they require some intensive training that can reliability checks, and they are typically focused on one child or adult at a time. Another difficulty arises when trying to get to places on the playground where these interactions are happening that may be somewhat difficult. So getting under the slide to see what's going on between children without interrupting that. So there's some advances in sensing tools that have been taking place, I would say, for maybe the past 6 or 7 years. And what these tools do are capture real-time behaviors during typical activities and contexts without the need for an observer. Some of the work that I've done has looked at using speech and location sensors to capture classroom adult talk, to also look at playmates, interactions between playmates, to get at a way to better understand friendship development. Some of the recent work that I've done has also looked at wandering in the classroom, and other panelists on this presentation have done this work as well. To my knowledge, this work on the playground is the first of its kind using these tools that I'll describe right now. So the tools that I use on the playground are Lena and UbaSense, and Lena is a speech recorder and processing tool that captures adult word count. It captures child vocalizations, peer vocalizations, as well as adult-child turns. And UbaSense is a real-time location system that captures the movement, and that can capture the movement and the location of multiple children and adults in a space multiple times per second. It's an objective approach. There's no human observer, and the estimates that come from the tag can be within a foot of it. So it's pretty accurate. So some of our research questions, the two that we have are how much time do children spend in different areas of the playground and on and slash near fixed equipment, and how much talk took place in these different areas of the playground, as well as on or near fixed equipment. The setting and participants, there were 11 toddlers, 8 were of typical development, and 3 had special needs. The 3 children with special needs, 2 had speech delays, and 1 had significant respiratory and abdominal organ issues. Children spent approximately 42 minutes on the playground. There were 3 areas of the playground. The first is the canopy area, which was 29 feet by 35 feet in length. The grassy area contained a sandbox, and it measured 56 feet wide by 110 feet in length. The edge of the canopy area was created in order so that we could more precisely locate children within and outside of the canopy versus grassy area, because there were some children that tended to hang out the edge, and there is a little bit of error that comes along with ubicence. So we needed to do this to be able to place the children in the correct area. It's not something we really run into in the classroom because we don't have children moving in and out of the space. Behind, let's see, the next. So this is a picture of the canopy area. And just to give you a sense of what went into setting up ubicence, there is a sensor over here on this pole, and we set up the 4 sensors using zip ties. These were connected with Cat5 cord into a power over Ethernet switch and laptop. We calibrated the tool to ensure the sensors were capturing the tag positions correctly. We used portable batteries to charge the system, keep the system powered, as well as a laptop. We used the individual location tags. We placed them around some of the larger pieces of equipment you're seeing in this picture in order to then look at when children were inside these areas, and to also examine the talk that took place. Behind this structure with the different color walls, it's like red, yellow, green, there's we have a table set up, and that's where we had our laptop and our PoE switch. So educators were told to go about their typical day. The children wore the Lena and ubicence tags and a shirt. You can see this is a child demonstrating where those tags went. In terms of data analysis, we developed a location clustering program through MATLAB to determine when children were on near individual pieces of equipment, as well as in the canopy and grassy areas. Then we use SPSS crosstabs to determine when children were on equipment or in these different areas, talking or receiving talk from others. So our results: on average, children spent 30 minutes in the canopy area, 10 minutes in the grassy area, and 2 minutes at the edge of the canopy. Children with special needs spent more time in the grassy area than outside of the canopy than their peers with typical development. And under the canopy, children spent a majority of time near or on the hippo, and the least amount of time was on or near the oval. So our approach yielded over 28,000 1-second speech and audio and location estimates. The speech estimates are a rate per minute. Children with special needs, encouragingly, children with special needs received more talk from peers and adults in the areas where they spent the most amount of time, which was the canopy area and grassy area, compared to kids with typical development. They also received, children with special needs, more talk from adults at more pieces of fixed equipment than children with typical development. And for those children with special needs, the most talk took place at the whimsical tree and the hippo, and for typical development, it was the oval and whimsical tree. So similar to our past studies using Lena and Ubicins in early childhood classrooms, the talk or lack thereof was directly linked to where children were spending a majority of their time. So there's some research that suggests that children with special needs are more likely to interact with adults on the playground compared to peers. And this may be because adults are more likely to respond positively or reliably, I guess, to bids for attention. And then there's also some evidence that children with special needs have fewer interactions with peers relative to kids with typical development. But as I just mentioned, our results are encouraging in that we found that both children with special needs received more talk from peers and adults than children with typical development. Some of our limitations, this is a small sample size. These are just preliminary results. So we have only 11 children. This took place on one day. And I should have mentioned it took place during summer. Let's see, our tools that we're using don't pick up on gestures. So that is something that we hope to look at in the future using perhaps cameras. We also had some overlapping speech and noise, which is not uncommon with these speech devices. The overlapping speech was 49%, and the noise took up about 3%. So that those are things that factor into or limit the amount of meaningful data that we have to work with. So some future directions. We know that physical activity is related to children's social engagement, so whether they're alone or with peers. This is something that we hope to look at in the future on the playground using Lena, Ubisense, and some type of accelerometer. We also are currently doing some work around keyword spotting in the classroom, looking at WH words in science in books. So in the future, we hope to look at some of these words and other types of words that are common on the playground that support interactions and physical activity. And also, our hope is to look at some of the peer mediated interventions that are used on the playground to support interactions with children with special needs, using this tool to provide ongoing data of speech and location. So the combination of Lean and Ubisense provides a method for capturing the talk of children with special needs, same age peers with typical development, and adults on the playground, all at the same time without the need for an observer. And our novel approach provides a means to capture information that could be used to potentially positively impact children's long-term outcomes, as well as inform the designs of playground contexts in order to support more interactions between children and peers and adults, their peers and adults. Thanks. So I'm going to hand it over to Daniel.
Welcome everybody to our symposium, Using Sensing Technologies in the Classroom to Better Understand Children's Experiences and Development. I'll be talking about interactive behavior in schools. My name is Daniel Messinger from the University of Miami. So interactive behavior in schools is IBIS. Here's our little IBIS. Our IBIS is wearing some of that tech that Dwight was talking about. These folks are our co-investigators, and I'll be introducing them over the talk. One of them is me. You can guess which one. Basically, Dwight has done the great introduction about the Ubisense and the Lena. We use these vests. And what you're seeing here is kids moving around a classroom. And that's what I want to talk to you about, how we can harness these objective measures to understand how kids are interacting and how they're developing. mostly in inclusion classrooms. So we're in the community. We're really trying to do this objective. We call it objective data acquisition measurement using these devices. Here's a little guy wearing the vest. In our vests, so we use the vest rather than the t-shirts. We have the Lena recorder, and we have 2 of the UbiSense recorders, and we'll use that to get orientation, which way the kid is facing. Okay, so I was minding my own business. This is the story of how it all happened. I was minding my own business, and Udo Rudolph over there on the left says, you know, you should check out these cool devices. Here's how they work. I've already measured a classroom full of kids, typically developing kindergartners, and you can see them bouncing around here. And the red guys are girls, and the blue guys are boys. I guess I said that kind of funny. And you can it's kind of evocative, like, oh, the red circles are hanging out more, maybe, but there's some mixing over there on the top left. The blue boys there are 3 blue boys and 1 girl. And we needed help in what to make of it, and we called on Cha-Ming Song over there on the right of the slide. Cha-Ming is a professor of physics at the University of Miami. And he said, yeah, I have ways to analyze those kinds of data to better understand when children are actually in social contact, when maybe this will work, like maybe these guys are close enough, given where everybody might be over the whole course of the observation, that we say they're in social contact, but these guys I'm not so sure about. I'll talk more about that, but we applied that in 3 observations. We made little social networks, and again, here are the girls and here are the boys. So we kind of validated the objective measures, the tech, by showing these kinds of homophily with respect to gender, you know, to some degree in the classroom. We then moved on. We have an ongoing collaboration with the Debbie School at the University of Miami. One of their programs, that was one of the pictures you saw, I think, in the 3rd slide, was the Debbie School, the Debbie Institute. And one of their programs is a program for kids with hearing loss. Now, these kids with hearing loss, you can see them here in the legend, they have a cochlear implant or a hearing aid. So they have some access to the speech signal. Oh, they stopped. But you can see them moving around. And remember that they're wearing 2 of those sensors. So that's why it's a triangle. So the triangle is telling us which way the child is facing. So this guy is facing this way, and this guy is facing this way. And these are kids with hearing loss. And when they're filled in, it means they're vocalizing to one another. So what we're doing is we're synchronizing the location from the UbiSense with the audio from the Lena. And then here's we call it G of R, it's the radial distribution function. But just to remember, the kids are all moving around. So you could imagine all the potential possible distances between all kids by chance. But if 2 kids are, wow, these guys are really close, or this close, let's say, within an area here, it's going to be between what we just called it between 0 and 1.5 meters. That's more than you'd expect by chance. So you'll see these graphs. They always mean, oh, we're trying to figure out whether or not the children are really in social contact. We also said, well, they have to be in social contact kind of closeness-wise, distance-wise, radius-wise, but they also have to be facing each other. So within 45 degrees of one another, more or less. We did this in this hearing loss classroom, and these methods here are they're gonna inform the next 2 slides, which are really what we did with the data. So first, Dr. Lynn Perry, my colleague, co-director of the IBIS project, says, well, that social contact that you found, that's great. Maybe vocalizations are particularly salient for kids within that social contact. Let's look at all the times one child talks to one of their classmates in one observation. So like in the first time we did this, I think there were 7 or 10 observations. They were like weekly intervals. Sometimes they're longer. It turns out it doesn't really matter. If child A speaks to child B this much in one observation, child B speaks to child A because they're both in social contact. That's the surmise here. This much in the next observation. And you can see you get a pretty nice line there. This is a log scale, so it goes up by like powers of 10 or something. We also find that you see the hearing loss in blue, the typical hearing in red, no difference between them in the frequency of their vocalizations. But there's this cool pattern again where how much I talk to my peer predicts how much my peer talks to me. It's a kind of dyadic process running through the classroom. Moreover, if we kind of divide it up into, I like to say semesters, but it's really the first half of observations and then the second. So how much A speaks to B in the first half of the observations, let's say several months, predicts how much B speaks to A in the second half of the observations, which in turn predicts the expressive language ability of the kids. And we use the PLS 5 at the end of the year. So this is kind of cool. So interactive pure speech is predicting language abilities. Yes, it is. Next step, Sam Mitzvin, my graduate student in the IBIS project, asks, is there more we can do with that speech signal? And she wasn't interested in social contact, so we'll forget social contact till the next project. And for her, the key was phonemic complexity. My take is this is just a way to tell us something about the complexity of the child's speech, the number of speech sounds in English that are present in each vocalization on average. What she finds is that the adults, which really here means the teachers, mean number of unique phonemes is associated with, this is the same observation, the number of the complexity of the child's speech. So you get this nice little association. And one thing to note here is that typical hearing kids have more complex speech phonemically than do the kids with hearing impairment, than do the kids with hearing loss. So we're seeing the difference in phonemic complexity there. Again, we do this mediation result. So here, teacher phonemic diversity predicts child phonemic diversity, which predicts receptive language ability. It also predicted expressive, exactly the same association. And that association looks like that, where we're taking the mean of the child's phonemic complexity of these vocalizations that they produced over the course of the year, and we're correlating it we're using it to predict the assessed language at the end. So what we've learned is both the frequency of children's talk with their peers and the complexity of their talk with teachers predicts language ability. We then moved to classes that contained inclusion classes. All the classes so far have been inclusion classrooms, except for that first typically developing kindergartens. And these guys are, these are preschoolers between like 3 and 5. Probably modal and mean age 4. So now we're in ASD classrooms, autism spectrum disorder. Of course, they also include other children. They're inclusion classrooms. We're looking at the social contact again. What Chitra Banerjee finds, an undergraduate at the time working on the project, is real evidence for homophily. That is, similar kids tend to hang out in social contact. And here we're just looking at the movement. We're just looking at the social contact. So you can see that TD kids hang out more with TD kids, DD kids who didn't have ASD with other DD kids who didn't have ASD, and ASD kids with other ASD kids. And they do that more than do the various combinations of what we call discordant dyads. So a lot of evidence for homophily there. In fact, more evidence for homophily than for straight up disability effects, which in some ways is I think, encouraging news, although these bars, the interaction effect is such that these bars, the DD and the ASD, even in homophilic dyads, the concordant dyads, were less than the TD-TD. The other cool thing is she looked at social approach. So I'm really taken by this this movement data, as you can tell, I think. So we're asking what kinds of kids approach each other. Here you see it with respect to ASD and TD, and I hopefully always the green, those are just adults hanging out. So they might be a teacher, or it might be an observer, making an activity log of the class. So we can look at the top part of this graph, and the issue is that, again, we see homophily. So typically developing kids down at the bottom are more likely to approach other typically developing children at higher velocities. DD kids approach other DD kids at higher velocities, and children with ASD approach other children with ASD at higher velocities. So we're seeing these robust effects for homophily in the preschool classroom by eligibility type, right? These are from the children's eligibility categories, perhaps more so than we'd like to see. But that's why we use the objective measurements, is to see what in fact is going on. Pulling in the vocalizations is Regina Fasano, one of Lynn Perry's students on the IBIS project. She's looking at all these. What she does is she makes social networks out of when the kids are in social contact. You remember that when they're speaking to each other. So it could be A to B or B to A. Both of those constitute the frequency of vocalizations in social contact. And networks are cool because you can use them to characterize the entire classroom. And that's really the idea, I think, of this objective measurement, is you can see everything, or at least that's the hope. Maybe you don't see that well, that's for you to judge, but you see everything. You're not just focusing on one kid, you see all the kids. So this is a social network. There are 5 classrooms, but I couldn't fit them here, so I scattered them around the slide. What we find is lower autism or ASD within group modularity. That is, if you look at the blue kids in those networks, they speak less to other kids, to other kids with ASD than you'd expect, given the the way speech is distributed throughout the classroom. So really, this plays on an observation by Laura Justice and her colleagues, in which they're saying the kids with ASD are excluded or excluding themselves from classroom resources, from language classroom resources. You can really see that here. Now we're looking at the number of individual connections a child has. That comprises our measure of degree centrality. The key thing here is it's still vocalizations and social contact to and from one's peers. That level of reciprocal vocalization predicts, again, the children's end of year assessed language on the PLS. So taking this forward, we're doing some future directions, some areas that I think will be important, and one of them is machine learning. So here we make no assumptions. We just know, oh, we got this cool video. The video displays all the kids moving around. Let's take a look at this kid first. Of course, we always take a look at every kid, but let's take a look at this kid first. This is where this kid is. This is where all the kids' peers are. This is how much this kid has vocalized in the last several minutes and how much their peers have vocalized in the last several minutes. That's coming through here through the Lena vocalizations. Let's use that and use deep neural networks to predict how much the child is going to vocalize in the next minute. And here we see a pretty good job of our ability to predict how much a child will predict in the next minute. These observations come from the hearing loss classrooms, but of course we could implement them in any classroom. So the key thing here is we're not saying social contact, not social contact. We're saying, well, speech may happen in different ways, maybe for kids with different diagnoses. Let's learn from the data how we can best predict how much a child will speak, because we know that the amount of a child's speech is a potent predictor of their language abilities and maybe also of their language development. So what does the IBIS say? So now you can see that the IBIS is wearing their little vest and it's got a little pocket for their tech. So the IBIS goes to school. What we're beginning to find is that this kind of objective measurement is scalable in inclusion classrooms. We're currently really in at least one classroom a day. Let me just say one classroom a day, 4 or 5 days a week. We can use it to look at the classroom structure to create those networks of how the kids are interacting, maybe throw in the teachers there. It gives us a window into these dyadic relationships in which how much A speaks to B predicts how much B speaks to A, which of course, you guessed it, is going to then predict again, right, how much A speaks to B, because we're doing this in weekly or monthly observations, currently more monthly. And fundamentally, we're trying to use this tech to get a sense of the interactive contributions to language development, how children's interactions in classrooms with peers and with teachers facilitates their growth, both kids who are on more typical developmental trajectories and kids who are more atypical developmental trajectories. So with that, lots of thanks. It takes a village. In this case, it takes 2 lab groups. So this is my lab group. This is Lynn's lab group. It takes IES and other funders that include the Spencer Foundation. Tiffany will talk about that project next. And resources from the Autism Science Foundation, the National Science Foundation. And currently we're being funded by NIDCD to look at the classrooms with children with hearing loss. I'd love to talk to you about this. You saw me call for your collaboration and also your questions. I can't wait. And let me now turn it over to Tiffany to talk about the Spencer Foundation project.
Thank you, Daniel. My name is Tiffany Foster. I'm from The Ohio State University. And today I'll be discussing an ongoing project that focuses on using sensing technologies to understand longitudinal peer social networks and early language development. To begin, we know that the preschool years are a time of rapid language development driven by the talk children are exposed to during interactions with others. Child-directed talk has been found to be particularly important for the acquisition of language skills. With an increasing number of children spending large portions of their early childhood in the preschool classroom, more attention is being placed on understanding how the interactions children experience in the preschool classroom contribute to their language development. Importantly, during the preschool years, children spend large portions of their time interacting with peers. By some estimates, children spend about half of their day in free play with peers. Due to the large quantities of time young children spend interacting with peers, researchers have started to consider the role these interactions may have in children's language development. In the peer effects literature, studies tend to find that children who are in classrooms with peers with higher language skills on average tend to show greater language growth. A recent study also found that peer effects operate independently of teacher effects, and peers may, in fact, have greater influence on children's language growth than teachers during the preschool years. A limitation of this literature is that the mechanisms through which peers have an influence on language development have not been thoroughly explored. One study by Chen and colleagues that aimed to address this limitation found that the language skills of peers with whom children interacted most frequently had the greatest influence on language development. In other words, who a child interacts with matters. A social network approach can help researchers understand the relation between who children interact with and language development. In a social network analysis, the links or ties among children in the classroom can be examined. And the figure on the right of the slide shows an example visualization of a peer social network. The dots represent children and the links represent their social connections. The child indicated by the solid green dot would be considered to have a large social network comprised of the peers within the circle. And the child indicated by the arrow would be considered an isolate with a very small peer social network. A child's position within the network is thought to have a direct influence on a child's experiences through constraints and opportunities created by the network, which in turn can have an influence on development. Concerning language development specifically, individual differences in peer interaction patterns likely shape language development. And a peer language network can be used to understand how language skill flows among the children in a classroom. Children who interact more frequently with peers with stronger language skills likely have more accelerated language development than children who interact with peers with lower language skills or children who are isolated from their peers. As I mentioned, some children are isolated from the classroom social network, meaning that they have access to fewer peer language resources than more well-connected children. As research highlights the importance of child-directed talk for supporting language development, these children may display slower language development as compared to their peers. Understanding who these children are and how their position within the classroom network shapes their language development has important implications for the educational practices teachers may adopt in the classroom to help peer language resources flow more successfully. Now I'll briefly discuss some methods that can be used to study social networks in preschool classrooms. Traditionally, researchers have relied on direct observations as the gold standard for understanding children's individual experiences in the classroom. And this approach may involve collecting and coding video or audio recordings or conducting in-person observations. However, these observations have multiple limitations. They're often impractical and costly in terms of time and money. Observations can also be biased by an observer's personal perspectives and beliefs, leading to potential difficulties accurately representing the social experiences of diverse groups of children. Observations can also have difficulty accurately representing children's complex social interactions. Language development is often influenced by dynamic and fleeting interactions that provide input to children's developing language systems, which aren't always captured by observations. Furthermore, during in-person observations, typically only one child can be observed at a time for short portions of the school day, leading to a loss of understanding of the interactions that are simultaneously occurring within the classroom. As we've been discussing, an emerging alternative to traditional observations are sensing technologies. And these are, again, tools that can be embedded in classrooms to collect and analyze data about multiple students simultaneously. As we've seen during the session, two common sensing technologies are location tracking devices and audio recorders used in combination with speech processing algorithms that can code recordings for information related to the quality and quantity of speech that a speaker produces and is exposed to. Some of the benefits of sensing technologies include the ability to capture continuous and potentially real-time information about individual and dynamic classroom experiences and interactions. Sensing technologies can also help researchers collect more objective data about the experiences of diverse groups of students, which is necessary to more accurately understand how peers may have a different influence on the language development of different children. Recent studies employing sensing technologies support the importance of reaching a more accurate understanding of children's individualized and dynamic classroom experiences. Using information on multiple children's location and orientation towards one another, researchers have created estimates of social contact among peers and generated a classroom social network. In another study, 680 hours of recorded audio files in one classroom were used to illustrate that the quantity of children's talk with peers over time related to growth in language skills. Other research has focused on refining technologies for use in the classroom. For example, algorithms have been developed to separate speech from background noise, which is important in noisy classroom environments. Software trained using child speech is also improving the accuracy of speech quality and quantity information that can be extracted from recordings. Now I will discuss an ongoing study of peer language networks in preschool classrooms that's employing the use of sensing technologies. The study focuses on the objective and continuous measurement of children's social and linguistic interactions with peers in the preschool classroom at multiple time points over the course of the year in order to reflect the changing dynamics of interactions within the classroom network. The overarching goal of the study is to precisely represent individual differences in preschoolers' linguistic experiences and identify salient predictors of these individual experiences. And more specifically, we plan to focus on identifying the social interactions that are most influential to preschoolers' language development. We aim to test the hypothesis that talk among children drives language development and that there are significant individual differences in the quality and quantity of talk that children are exposed to. Our goal is to have 30 classrooms with a sample of about 500 children, and these classrooms will be recruited at 3 different sites: The Ohio State University, the University of Miami, and the University of Kansas. In each classroom, we aim to have active or passive consent for 90% or more of the children in order to accurately represent the peer language network. Children's language skills will be measured at 3 time points in the fall, winter, and spring of the preschool year. Teachers will rate children's functional communication skills on a 4-point scale ranging from never to always using the Descriptive Pragmatics Profile, or DPP. And the DPP includes 3 subscales: nonverbal skills, conversational skills, and skills involving asking for, giving, and responding to information. Children's expressive communication skills will also be directly assessed using the Preschool Language Scale 5th edition, or PLS 5. The sensing system we'll be using is called the Interaction Detection in Early Childhood Settings, or IDEAS system. Children and teachers will be wearing small, non-invasive pouches as shown as in the top picture on the slide. In the pouch will be a small Bluetooth beacon and a voice recorder. And the Bluetooth beacon will work in conjunction with Bluetooth antenna as shown in the image on the bottom right. The antenna will be placed around the perimeter of the classroom to capture children's locations relative to the locations of their teachers and peers. And each beacon will be uniquely identifiable, so we'll be able to determine which peers and teachers a child spends the most time near. The voice recorders will collect the speech that individual children produce and are exposed to in the classroom. Used in combination, the location and talk data will allow us to estimate who children talk to and how often, as well as the quality and quantity of that talk, including the total number of words, the total number of utterances, and the lexical diversity, or the total number of different words. To determine what is said and when, open source and pay-as-you-go automatic speech recognition software will be used to segment and automatically transcribe the recordings. And to identify the type of speaker of each utterance, cluster grouping algorithms will be used to label each utterance. So for example, we'll be able to tell if it's a child or a teacher. The sensing systems can also capture information about interactions among dyads, as well as larger groups of children and teachers who may be interacting simultaneously. Based on the location data, interactions are considered to be occurring if a child is near and oriented toward a peer or group of peers. And then data from the audio recorders can then be used to determine whether verbal interactions are occurring within the group of peers. Traditional in-person observations will be also conducted using the Social Network Observation Coding Scheme, or SNO. A child will be randomly selected from each classroom to be the focal child of the observation. The child will be observed for 30 minutes during free play. And the SNO captures information about whether a child is communicating with peers, the type of interaction that's occurring, such as cooperation or rough and tumble play, and whether the interactions being experienced are positive or negative. And these observations will help us understand more about the validity of the IDEAS system when it's used at scale. Finally, teachers will rate children's peer interactions on the Teacher-Rated Peer Interactions Measure, or TRPI, using a 5-point scale ranging from never to always. And the image on the slide illustrates how each pair of children will receive a rating, and both play and conflict interactions will be rated for each pair. A few additional measures will be collected throughout the study, including demographic information about the children, their caregivers, and teachers. Teachers will report information about their classrooms, such as the number of boys and girls. And teachers will also complete the teacher-child rating scale, which focuses on positive and negative aspects of a child's social, emotional, school adjustment, and the student-teacher relationship scale, which focuses on teacher perceptions of their relationships with individual children. This slide provides an overview of a simplified study timeline. In the fall of 2021, we're taking baseline measures of the language skills, and teachers will also rate children's peer interactions. Starting in the winter, sensing technology observations will be occurring for 2 days per week at 4 to 8 different time points, and observations will be conducted for the full school day. The in-person observations will occur on 6 randomly selected technology observation days for 30 minutes. And then in the spring of 2022, outcome data on the language measures will be collected, as well as another teacher rating of the peer interactions. Using the data from the IDEAS system, we will be able to create a peer language network with the direct talk to or from individual children as the ties linking children within the network together, and teacher talk will also be accounted for. Approaches for longitudinal social network modeling and evaluating changes in networks over time will allow us to represent the social interaction groups that children are part of and how these groups influence language development, taking into account the evolution of the network over the course of the year. Considering our future analyses at the classroom level, social network indices we can consider include network density, which represents the average language input associated with each child in a peer language network. Network centralization, which represents the degree of unequal distribution of language input among children in a peer language network. And network assortativity, which represents children's tendency to associate with similar others. At the individual level, we can represent each child's weighted peer language resources. Differences based on child characteristics such as gender, baseline language skills, and social skills will also be examined. And to conclude with a few implications of this work, one of the long-term implications is the development of technology-mediated instructional tools that will allow teachers to monitor and better understand children's interactions in preschool settings. With sensing technologies embedded in the classroom, teachers could have access to real-time information about children's daily peer experiences. For example, technology may show that a child is being excluded from the classroom's social network and has access to limited peer language resources, signaling the need for the teacher to intervene. And such intervention could potentially improve the child's classroom experiences and developmental outcomes. Sensing technologies also have the potential to help researchers collect more objective data to reach a better understanding of the language development of diverse groups of children whose social experiences in the classroom can vary widely. We view children's spontaneous language within the classroom context to be a strong positive input to other children's development. Spontaneous language captured using sensing technologies can reveal strengths in children that are not evident on more decontextualized tasks, which may be biased against children from minoritized backgrounds. We also acknowledge the importance of not relying exclusively on the use of sensing technologies to reduce bias in our research, which is something we will consider as we move forward with our work. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you for your attention, and thank you to the investigators on this project. If you have questions after this session, you can contact me. And now we will move on to the live Q&A portion of the session.
Thank you for joining us for the question and answer part of this panel. I'm Laura Justice, and I am going to serve as the moderator. Encouraging you to jump in and ask questions about the work shared with you. And we can do it via the chat. So we have a question from Sarah Serene. Her question is about language environments and dual language learners in early education settings. And so I'm curious, Dwight, Tiffany, Daniel, does any of your work look at the dual language learner in classroom environments and their interactions with others and language exposure?
One of my sorry, you could go.
No, go ahead.
Okay. One of my dissertation papers, it wasn't using sensing technology, but it was looking at peer effects in the classroom. And I did look at the child's DLL status as a moderator and found some evidence that in some instances, DLL children appear to benefit more from exposure to peers with higher language skills in terms of their own English language development specifically. And this was looking at the peers' English language skill.
Daniel, I think you were going to jump in.
So that sounds like an interesting result, Tiffany. Yeah, so we're in Miami, so we have plenty of dual language learners, and it is an interesting tapestry of languages, and I guess we're quite interested in investigating these effects. We don't have answers yet, and I'm not even sure how to best phrase the questions yet. It would be nice if we could distinguish languages from children's individual recorders automatically, so we knew whether they were hearing, for example, Spanish or English and speaking Spanish or English. And we're at work on that problem, but it's
interesting. I'm wondering, this is such an interesting thread, thinking about young kids who are bilingual in an early education setting. The other children are, some of them may be monolingual in Spanish, monolingual in English, or very immersed bilingually. I'm curious about the technology itself and how far the technology is in terms of contending with a multilingual environment. So for instance, Daniel, Dwight, when you're using the Lena recording devices or the new Ideas system, is it language general? Can it capture, say, exposure to complex language and differentiate across languages?
so the recorders, be they Lena recorders or, for example, the Sony recorders we're using in the new Spencer project, are just recorders. And then we submit them to whatever software seems, most up to the task. Lena should be language agnostic. It shouldn't really care which language. There were questions raised about that by the folks who introduced new technology that goes by the name Alice, but I think that was more from a kind of Germanic Scandinavian language question and more about adult speech. And then there is technology, like, for example, from Google to distinguish what language is being spoken, but I don't know its reliability for, the noisy classroom environments in which we work. Sorry, Dwight.
Oh, no, I I think it's a really interesting question. I don't know of folks who have done that work. Yeah, I would have to talk to my speech processing colleagues, I think, to ask them about whether that is possible. I mean, I know they've looked at multiple languages to see the accuracy in terms of algorithms to process the speech, but whether it distinguishes a language, it seems possible, but.
I think I read that Alice paper you're referring to, Daniel, and if anybody wants to shoot me an email, I think I have it handy, but the Alice technology is processing language, outputting metrics of language that we all discussed in the presentation. And I do recall that is language independent. So there was a question that I wanted to put out there from Katie Zimmerman. And she asked about expanding on the technological and system requirements. And I think, Tiffany, we have a new collaboration across these three research groups, us at OU, Dwight at Kansas, and Daniel and his team of Florida. And we have a new system that Tiffany talked about called IDEAS, and work with wonderful engineers. And I'll get us started, and then any one of you can jump in and talk a little bit more about the technology. But we're actually using we're using microphones, right, Daniel, that kids are wearing. They're wearing microphones. I don't think they're terribly expensive. And then we have beacons set up in the room to track movement. But the recorders capture kids' their own voice as well as incoming talk from others. And we have a pipeline that processes that talk, both one's own talk as well as incoming talk, a long processing system. And then you get the output of such things like how much a child is spoken to, things like the lexical diversity of that incoming talk and even outgoing talk. And there's no manual work whatsoever. The only manual work, I know what you're getting at. I mean, sort of the way we do this work is we sit, we videotape, we transcribe. It's a nightmare. It takes 92 years. And so what we're doing now is that whole manual element is completely gone. It's totally automatized. And the only manual work that we do is to calibrate and validate the system. Daniel, Dwight, Tiffany, you want to add to that anything more specific?
I mean, so the goal is definitely to use kind of off-the-shelf sensors. There are different choices to make in terms of the sensors. So one that we've been talking about is to use a Lena recorder, which is like really $200 or $300, or what is in fact a technically superior, for example, Sony recorder, which I think are about $100. So in future projects in the IDEA project, we're going for the Sonys. You know, the Sonys weren't built for the Lena algorithm, so that's what occasioned, I think, choices to use Lena in the past. And then you have choices with respect to how you're going to track children's movements. So one choice is UbiSense, or ultra-wide radio frequency identification. So that's very cool, and that it tells you where everybody is all the time in real kind of space, but it costs a lot. A more economical solution is using Bluetooth-based badges, which tell you when two people are in contact, but not necessarily where they are all the time. So there are kind of trade-offs along the way, but I put this in the chat. I think the idea of all the investigators is that, and I think all of us, is that we want something that's pretty turnkey, right? So you can more or less kind of buy it and with the right personnel, implement it and get automated data collection.
I like this question from Mike. Dwight, I'm really interested in you perhaps expanding on the work you've done on playgrounds, perhaps here. So the question is, can you speak to potential instructional activities and behaviors that can support peer interactions, or the potential benefit of peer-mediated interventions? Daniel and Dwight, you both have done some really interesting work looking at context sort of cross-sectionally with some of the language environment work we've been doing. Can either of you, and Tiffany, of course, you can always jump in on this too, especially since we're testing a peer-mediated intervention here at Ohio State. So all of you.
Yeah, I think one of the exciting things about this sensing equipment is it does allow us to look at peer-mediated interventions on the playground, in the classroom, in ways that maybe well, in ways that we haven't been able to see how kids are interacting previously, continuously, across multiple days, across multiple peers, in a simultaneous manner. I haven't looked at any kind of evaluation of those interventions. It's really up to this point just been descriptive in terms of trying to get at kids' interactions within the space and the specific features of the space. So whether that's pretend play, or out on the playground, on the slide, these kinds of things. But I think the potential is there for that. And it does seem like, particularly with some of the equipment we're currently using that is scalable, that we could start to think about setting up sensors, I don't know, in and outside of the classroom, and to be able to provide teachers with feedback on some of those, the level of interactions that children are having, so that if well, I guess during a peer mediated intervention, so if to basically see how effective it is ongoing and afterwards, to see how sustainable it is, and whether those interactions continue when it's done.
Also, with these sensing technologies being able to provide us with so much individual level data going forward, as these technologies become more affordable and accessible, I think it'll be interesting to be able to address questions of how these types of interventions might work differently for individual kids, and how the question of, again, like why some interventions appear to work really well for some kids and not so great for others. Questions along those lines. And even as this data is available like in real time, whether like adjustments could be made to improve an intervention for a specific kid. I guess that would be more at a practical level, like for teachers being able to use this technology in real time and make adjustments to this.
Yeah, I think it just opens up so many new questions for us. I mean, I've done a little bit of work looking, Daniel's done this too, looking at children's friendships, but I mean, we can start to look at the time that children are spending together, and the talk that they have, and how that develops children's, how it moves them from being playmates to friends. I mean, this same idea could be used, I mean, in terms of, I think, well, when we're thinking about peer mediated interventions, and how those interventions are supporting, I guess, more, I don't know, meaningful, stronger relationships with kids.
There's a good question here from Adrian. Can I jump in? Yeah, I'm just doing it. No permission needed. Question from Adrian. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Has anybody have we found anything about upper limit in number of participants?
I think so far we're well within the upper limit. There are technical limitations. Here's a funny little technical limitation. Because of where the UbiSense sensors are placed, we're better at knowing kind of more like how you think about where you are in the classroom than knowing how up and down you are, your vertical location, your height. But that's not what you asked. Yeah, it seems like we're fine in terms of number of students. And I think there are different approaches to this issue of consent. At Miami, if you don't consent, you don't wear a vest, but we might hear your vocalizations. It's true. We don't know where you are. Also, if a child doesn't want to wear their vest, for example, just saying on Monday for part of breakfast, then they don't wear the vest until they wear the vest.
Yeah, I would say, I totally agree with Daniel in terms of the number, the limits. For it's dependent. I mean, how many sensors you need to set up is dependent on the space. So, like on the playground, if we want to get larger spaces and we have bigger playgrounds, they all tend to vary, which makes it a little difficult. It requires more sensors. But in terms of the number of individuals that can wear the tags, I don't think there are limits. I mean, at least with the UBASense system that I've worked with in the past is pretty robust, and I mean it's developed for industry, so they're using it to track like planes and cars and storage yards and movement of people in factories, and so they're able to handle it's able to handle a lot of individuals wearing the tags. And I haven't heard of any restraints with or constraints with the really active system that we're working with now. So
yeah, some really good questions about the logistics of doing this. I will start by saying that the question about kids who are wearing the vest, not wearing the vest. Tiffany, have you been out in the field collecting data right now? Whereas we've been piloting our sensing system.
Not yet.
Because it's really unobtrusive. We use t-shirts, we use vests. You can even put these on necklaces or whatever. So it's pretty unobtrusive. In other words, I don't get the sense it's pretty obvious who's wearing the technology. Dwight, has that been your case at Kansas?
Sorry, ask that again, Laura. I was looking at the chat. I was reading the question. I should have been doing that.
So right now with our the collection we're doing, how are kids wearing a vest or a t-shirt? I know we went back and forth.
I think we just have it it's in a like a strap, it's a holder, and it goes around their shoulder, and that's what we're thinking that we'll be using. We have used vests and shirts in the past, and that's been totally fine.
Yeah, we've spent, it was just a couple of years ago that we were strapping GoPros on kids' heads, and we wanted to get away from that. And that's kids wearing GoPros and kids who aren't probably did affect lots of things in the classroom. But with the technologies we're working on, we really have spent a lot of time on feasibility for lots of, it's a pretty big ask of teachers to say, we want to come in and put all these sensors in classrooms. So we've really spent a lot of time on the social validity element. I did want to comment on the consent issue because we've been very successful at Ohio State. We've been doing social network, IES supported social network work for a couple years now. And for social network work in a classroom, you really need to represent the whole classroom if at all possible. So if you've got 12 kids in a classroom, you really want to have participation of all 12 kids, or you're somehow biasing, representation of that social network. And so we have had a lot of luck with passive consent in the last couple years. And so what that means is we'll get active consent maybe for, 10 of the 15 kids in the classroom, and our human subjects panel will let us use passive consent, where we'll say to the parents, if you don't return this consent form, we're still going to collect certain data on your child passively. And I think KU, you're following in our footsteps around the passive consent for the social network data.
Yep, that's right. Yeah. And just one thing related to the biggest problem I've had with the shirts in the past is that I don't have all the colors that kids want. So we'll end up we'll get in the classroom, but one of them will want and then we don't have it. It's dirty or it's being used in another classroom. So.
Katie Zimmerman asked a question about bandwidth requirements, and do we ever have to supplement connectivity? I will say that all of our work in Ohio with the technology has largely been in Central Ohio, more urban settings. Daniel, Dwight, have you had any issues with connectivity or bandwidth?
With Ubisense, it's not connected. We're not connected to the internet, so that's not an issue. I mean, it's connected to a laptop, and the data is just, and then that's connected to the power over Ethernet switch that then links up to the sensors, and the data just comes into the laptop, and then we go and pick it up. I don't, in our testing of the really active system, I don't think we've had any, I haven't seen any or heard about any bandwidth issues. So I think it seems to be working well in that regard, but it's based on our testing.
Yeah, so the Ubisense is like its own little network, but and it has cables attaching the 4 sensors or however many sensors there are in the classroom, or if it's a bigger classroom or a classroom with kind of 2 rooms, we have some of those. So the cool thing is you don't need the internet. The bad thing is you do have to connect those cables correctly. And then this is funny, we have had bandwidth issues. So the system itself doesn't require, it's not talking to the outside world while it's collecting data. But we take a lot of time to synchronize our devices. And to do that, we log into like it's time.gov or something. And if the team can't log into time.gov because some of these schools, like the internet is not what it should be, I made them buy a hotspot.
Yeah, the clocks are really important when working with multiple devices and trying to sync them up.
Are there other questions or even comments? I will I'll make a closing comment, which is, going back to Daniel saying, we invite you to join up with us. Our vision at Ohio State, and I think Daniel, Dwight, and I found each other like 2 days ago, because there really is nobody doing this kind of work. And I think we all have a shared vision, which is that we can use, the way that we do observational work in classrooms is really, really crude. It is not what we ought to be doing in 2022. We're going into a classroom, we're watching for 20 minutes, we're making some sort of global rating, and we're drawing really big inferences from these tiny little snapshots, which is why I think what we're finding in 2021, 22 is that these tools are not holding up in terms of having predictive validity with outcomes. And so, our vision is that we can harness these technologies to develop an extremely rich and deep understanding of kids' experiences in classrooms, hopefully get to the point where we can identify the ones that are truly driving development. And then what we really want to do is develop a real-time continuous control system. And, we work with engineers who are experts in control systems where maybe there's some sort of dashboard or visual and the teacher is capturing real information about kids. For instance, Dwight, nobody's talked to Dwight all day. Dwight is being isolated, and we know that at a very precise level based on the data we're getting. And then the teacher can react to that by setting up a peer group so that Dwight is going to engage with his peers through the rest of the day. And so, that's at least part of the vision, that we're going to move beyond, exploration and description to truly designing educational tools that can be used and get with the 21st century in classroom observations. Daniel, Dwight, Tiffany, any other last vision? Where do you see this going? Where do you want to go? Wow, thanks, John Lee. Nice comment in the chat.
Yeah, oh, sorry, Daniel. I didn't mean to.
I have a tiny comment.
Okay.
Sorry, it's smaller in scope, but I have to respond because it's Lisa from our program. So Lisa, the Sony recorders, we haven't started that audio pipeline yet in Miami, but they were independently guy extolled their virtues in terms of, a pianist, computer scientist guy was like, these actually tell time. These are actually accurate.
And to Emily Weaver's question, hi, Emily. Has there been work comparing the sensing data to teacher report? We're doing it as we speak. We did a pilot study and we did we try to get, when we're trying to enact a social network in a classroom, historically we'll get that social network in maybe 3 different ways. We have child report via the typical peer nomination task, teacher grids, observation, and now we're laying in the sensing data. And ideally down the road, we'll only need to use the sensing data because it's so easy to get. There we go. So Altman et al. 2020, there's a published European journal. You'll have to go to Europe to download it. Okay, any last questions?
Well, and just going back to what you mentioned, Laura, in terms of where it's going, I mean, I see this as like I mentioned earlier, it just it allows us to get at some questions that I think we haven't been able to get a real good handle on. And I also think of it as a way to take the data collection burden off of teachers as well. So we can start to provide them data so that they can focus on what's, just remove this element of it and let us do that. And then we can give that back to them in ways that are easily interpretable so that they can make decisions about supporting kids and setting up classrooms and playgrounds. Another thing that I'm thinking that we haven't quite touched on is these can be, we can set up these systems and the teachers can put on these devices and we can do it, we can set things up and potentially, and we can exit and have minimal contact with teachers and students. So just in the times that we're living in, where that's kind of an important thing given COVID. I mean, these tools offer us a way to potentially do that and get our data without having somebody having to hang around in the classroom for long periods of time, or pulling kids for to do assessments on them. So it's
fun fact to piggyback on that, Dwight, in terms of sort of the time of COVID theme and not being in classrooms. We actually there's actually people over here at the Ag School at Ohio State who I found out were actually in early learning centers in Ohio using almost the same sensing technologies as us, because they actually study viral spread in classrooms. And so, and they you have a kid come into the classroom. Well, in this case, maybe the child test positive for the COVID the next day, and they're actually looking at how diseases are transmitted in classrooms as kids are in contact with each other. So, what we're doing isn't all that crazy when you think of people down the road. Well, I won't call it crazy, it's different. All right, yes, Tiffany.
I was just going to say just a broad comment of just generally being excited to see where this technology goes in the future. And as it becomes more accessible and easy to use and more affordable, what other researchers are going to be able to do with it, to really start painting a more complex understanding of individual experiences in the classroom. I know just doing some research into this technology, there are things that exist to detect things like laughter and sentiment and keywords, and how those can be applied into the classroom to really understand these interactions that children are experiencing. And yeah.
All right, well, I think it's okay if we stop a few minutes short of our 3:45 end time. Thank you everybody for tuning in, and Daniel, Dwight, and Tiffany for your really fabulous, clear, concise presentations. And Have a great rest of your session, everybody.